11 people now lay dead on the floor. The royal family, 3 servants, and Dr. Botkin. Even a pet dog was not spared. A coded telegram was sent to Moscow, informing the Bolshevik leaders that their ghastly orders had been carried out. A blanket of silence then descended, but word soon leaked out that something terrible had happened to the royal family. However, it would be more than 60 years before any trace of them would surface. On February 17, 1920, less than 2 years after the Romanovs had been executed by the Bolsheviks, a young woman was pulled out of a canal in Berlin, Germany. Apparently suffering from amnesia, the woman was placed in a mental asylum. While there, a fellow patient noted her remarkable resemblance to the Grand Duchess Tatiana, the second oldest of the late Tsar's 4 daughters. 2 years later, she left the asylum. She adopted the name Anna Anderson, but insisted she was in reality Anastasia, the Tsar's youngest daughter. Although by then it was generally assumed that the Tsar and his immediate family had been murdered, no bodies were ever found. The mysterious woman said with the secret help of one of the executioners, she had managed to escape from the house at Ekaterinburg and make her way to the Black Forest in Germany. But relatives of the Romanovs were not convinced and contemptuously dismissed her as an impostor, claiming she was in fact a Polish factory worker. But there were those who believed her story, and they launched a legal action in Germany to prove it. The case dragged on until 1970, when the judges finally ruled that she was not Anastasia. By then, Anna Anderson had moved to the U.S., where she married a wealthy and eccentric genealogist, Jack Manahan, one of her most ardent supporters. Meanwhile, the house where the Tsar and his family were killed was becoming a place of pilgrimage for Russian monarchists. This so alarmed the government, headed by Leonid Brezhnev, that in September 1977, they ordered the building razed to the ground. The destruction was carried out under the auspices of the local Communist Party chief, Boris Yeltsin, who became the Russian president 13 years later. All that now marked the massacre site was a simple wooden cross. No trace of the bodies of the Tsar and his family had ever been found, but there were still people determined to solve the mystery once and for all. In May 1979, Russian writer and filmmaker Gely Ryabov and Alexander Avdonin, a geologist and historian, made a momentous discovery in the woods near Ekaterinburg. As Ryabov explained, they found what they believed to be a Romanov grave, but because the government had tried to keep the execution a secret, they carefully recovered the site.
I found all the family there. There were bullet holes in their heads and broken jars of sulfuric acid that they'd used to try to destroy the bodies. I'm totally convinced that this is the grave. I've got no doubts.
Avdonin recalled later their feeling of deep emotion when they realized the enormity of their discovery.
When we began digging, we prayed to God that we wouldn't find anything. It was too frightening. But we did find them. The emotional strain on us was enormous. Some of us started running around shouting, "We found them." After that, I was ill for 2 months.
Fearful of official reaction, Avdonin and Ryabov told no one about their find for 10 years. But then the report of Yakov Yurovsky, leader of the execution squad, was released from government archives. Yurovsky wrote that once they killed everyone in the basement, the bodies were thrown down an abandoned mine shaft a few miles north of Ekaterinburg. However, 2 days later, the bodies were retrieved and taken deep into the surrounding forest. 9 of the corpses were soaked in acid and buried in a grave, which was then covered with old railway ties. The bodies of Anastasia and Alexei were kept back, and an attempt was made to dispose of them by fire. When this failed, they were buried elsewhere. Despite Yurovsky's report, the Russian government was still reluctant to admit that the execution had been officially sanctioned.
I just hope the authorities will admit the truth. They talk about putting the record straight. They should admit the excesses of the revolution. It won't diminish their credibility. It'll increase it in the eyes of the world.
In 1991, the government relented and gave permission for the grave to be reopened. Working with foreign forensic experts, they came across the remains of 9 people. But were they the long-missing Romanovs? The only way to prove it was by DNA testing, so the Russians turned to the British Forensic Science Service in England for help. Using a sample of blood provided by the Duke of Edinburgh, who was a descendant of the Tsarina Alexandra, the British scientists, led by Dr. Peter Gill, were soon convinced that they were indeed the remains of the Romanovs.
We are 98.5% certain that this is the Romanov family. There is a small element of doubt there, but the evidence is very much in favour of this being the Romanov family.
The investigation then turned to the 2 missing family members. The experts concluded that they were Crown Prince Alexei and one of his sisters. They thought it could be Anastasia, but weren't sure. So the case of Anna Anderson was reopened. She had insisted that she was the Tsar's daughter, Anastasia, right up to her death from cancer in 1984. Her body was cremated, but tissue from the tumor which finally killed her had been preserved. If she really was Anastasia, DNA testing would surely find the answer. So Dr. Peter Gill and his team got to work again. He announced the results in October 1994.
Well, this is a family tree. Here the Tsar, Tsarina, and there are 5 children. And here we trace the maternal lineage of Tsarina Alexandra's sister, Princess Victoria of Hesse, had a daughter, Alice of Battenberg, who had a son, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. These diagrams here show the crucial differences or similarities between the sample. Again, here we have the Duke of Edinburgh, great-nephew of the Tsarina, and he's actually different at 6 different places, 6 different letters in this very long word, compared to the Anna Anderson sample. Firstly, the sample said to have come from Anna Anderson could not be associated with a maternal relative of the Tsarina or of His Royal Highness Prince Philip.
It was therefore conclusively determined that Anna Anderson was not Anastasia. Once news got out that the remains of the Romanovs had been found and identified at last, memorial services were held across Russia. The authorities did nothing to prevent this show of devotion to the Tsarist regime, which had been abolished in 1917. There seemed little point. It took almost 80 years before the truth of the murder and disappearance of the Russian royal family was finally revealed, even though the remains of Anastasia and Alexei have never been discovered. Prince Rostislav Romanov, the Tsar's great-nephew, expressed his feelings.
It really does finally prove what a lot of us have felt, that they were murdered, and it closes a chapter and allows us to go on to something more positive in the future.
The prince was asked what he thought might have happened to Anastasia and Alexei.
My own thoughts are that they both were killed with the rest of the family. As to why their bodies were not found, I don't know. I suppose one plausible explanation is that when the Russians set out to destroy the bodies, they probably actually succeeded in destroying 2 out of the 11, the smallest 2.
In 1995, following an elaborate and emotional funeral ceremony in St. Petersburg Cathedral, the remains of Tsar Nicholas II and his family were finally laid to rest. The official end of Tsarist Russia.